Hello, this is Botany and Plant Sciences course 031, Spring Wildflowers. And this is class 3, the third lecture of week 8 that corresponds to Friday, the 22nd of May, year 2020. Today, we're going to complete this week that is dedicated to the Asteraceae, the sunflower family, and the Poaceae, the grasses. This Friday, we're going to see some data on the grass family. Next week, we're going to complete it. We're going to complete our discussion on the grass family, analyzing the importance of grasses for global agriculture and for feeding the world. So let me start today's PowerPoint slides, and we'll begin our discussion on grasses. The grass family is a huge family. It contains I don't even know the exact number, but it must be in the order of 25,000 species. And it's an incredibly cosmopolitan family. There are grasses in the Arctic tundra. There are grasses in the rainforest. There are grasses in practically every ecosystem you can imagine, of all sizes and tolerances. Grasses are important and dominant in desert environments, and in the form of bamboos and other canes are also very important in rainforests, both tropical and temperate rainforest. So it has a huge diversity. You have some really big grasses like the giant bamboo, some very, very small, minute grasses like the ones that grow in high mountains, the alpine meadows, or in the Arctic environments. They grow sort of close to ground level to tolerate the freezing temperatures and the harsh winds. So what is it that makes a grass a grass? How can you recognize a grass? Well, first of all, the grasses can be recognized by their vegetative morphology. Even if you don't have any flowers to recognize them, the vegetative morphology is really, really very distinctive. Grasses are monocots, and as such, they have parallel veined leaves. You can see here in this illustration. In that sense, they are very, very similar to lilies, for example, or to reeds, or to sedges. They all have linear, parallel veined leaves. But grasses have something that makes them quite unique and very easy to distinguish and identify. The leaf is divided into two very distinct parts. It has the blade of the leaf, which is what we see coming out of a grass growing in the field. But then when the blade reaches a point of this structure that looks like a stem, we'll talk in a second about it because it's not really a stem, it sort of turns around and forms a tubular structure that is known as a sheath. So the petiole of the leaf is highly transformed into a tubular structure that is called the sheath. So the blade, the existence of very distinct blades and sheaths with an abrupt junction between the two is what makes the morphological interpretation of grasses so easy. There is no other monocot that has leaves so distinctive and so strongly separated into two parts. There are a number of other things that come with the architecture of blades and sheaths. And perhaps the most important is this little membrane that normally is present in the juncture of the blade and the sheath that is known as the ligula. The ligula is a membrane. Sometimes it's greenish, other times it's just white or even transparent. And its main role is to prevent water coming down through the bundle of leaves, penetrating inside the sheath and perhaps starting a process of rotting of the leaf. So it keeps the leaf dry from incoming rain penetrating inside the sheath, and it forces water to run around the ligula to keep on falling down the stem until it reaches the ground where the roots are. The other structure that might be present are these two little sort of horn-like structures, two little leafy spikes coming out that are known as the auricles. The auricles are very small. Not all grasses have them, but they do have taxonomic values. The people that study grasses can identify a species even if it doesn't have flowers just by looking at the auricles. Now, this architecture implies something that is really interesting. You might think that this tubular structure that grows here in the middle is really a stem. And this might look like a node and a leaf coming out of a node, then an internode and another leaf coming out of a node. That is not correct. That is not the case. As a matter of fact, in most grasses at the beginning of their growth, the stem, as shown here in this illustration, is really a rosette, a very shortened stem. It's a short shoot. And the leaves grow from the short shoot with their sheaths. So really this structure here is a set of sheaths, one inside the other, and the leaves coming out at different heights. So this thing that looks like a quote-unquote stem is really a hollow structure formed by the sheaths. So much so that when the sheaths dry, when the grass, if it's an annual crop, reaches the end of its life, you can actually cut this, and the dry stem that is known as a straw, you can use it actually to suck liquid from a cup, for example. Hence, we call to this day the little tubes that you use to get liquid from a cup to drink sodas, for example, we call them straws, because over 100 years ago, farmers used the sheaths of grasses, the dry sheaths of grasses, to especially of cultivated cereals like wheat or barley, to drink from cups. So this is a fascinating structure, really, because imagine that this grass is eaten by a herbivore, and it's cut at this stage here at the height where it says vegetative morphology, right? You may think, well, that's the end of the stem. No, not at all, because the stem is very, very low at ground level. What you're cutting really are the sheaths, which are the petiole of the leaf. So really a grass, and that is quite similar to the family we saw, the other monocot family we saw, the Liliaceae, in which really it's a rosette of leaves coming out from ground level, and the shoot itself is very shortened, and it is at ground level, protected from the grazing of herbivores. This whole structure, the base, the short shoot, the sheaths coming out, is known as a culm, C-U-L-M. And culms are really the basis of the formation, the vegetative formation of grasses. Any grass plant that you see is a population of culms. Now, there are two types of grasses, basically in morphology, that we call them sod grasses and bunch grasses, or also lawn-forming grasses and tussocks. A sod grass does not comes without stems. It does have stems that are elongated with leaves coming out in the nodes, internodes, and it runs along the ground with stolons until it reaches a point in which you have a culm coming up. And then it keeps on growing in the ground and you have a culm coming out. These type of grasses, sod grasses, tend to cover the ground perfectly well and make a lawn. Bunch grasses or tussock grasses are are really erect in growth. They form a bunch. They form a population of culms coming up into the air, and they can grow much higher than salt grasses. The distribution really depends on the ecosystem. Temperate forests, temperate ecosystems like Northern Europe, if you've ever been to England or Northern France, Germany, you would see uh, grasslands with sheep, for example, and they're basically occupied by sod grasses, by ground level grasses that form a carpet at ground level that is grazed by animals. We also use them, I mean human beings. We use them for aesthetic purposes to make lawns and turf grasses with turf grasses. Sorry, bunch grasses or tussocks occur in very wild ecosystems and normally at high altitude, or also sometimes in steeps and windy ecosystems. Tussocks form a dense bunch of culms growing all together and coming up, and they protect each other by forming a dense mat of grasses, hence their abundance in extreme ecosystems like mountain ecosystems. You will see them in parts of Patagonia. You will see them in the high Andes here. You can see one in Peru with a llama. You will also see tussock grasses in places like the Rocky Mountains in Colorado or in Asia in the Himalayas. All these high altitude ecosystems are populated by bunch grasses, by tussock forming grasses. Grasses in many parts of the world form an ecosystem we call grasslands or prairies. Although most prairies, unfortunately, have been turned into agricultural fields, their native grassland has been plowed to turn it into agricultural fields. It used to be and still is, in terms of area, the most important ecosystem in the world in terms of extension. Although, as I was saying, what really survives of native grasslands, like what survives of the big prairies of the United States, is only a fraction of what they were in their former glory, because prairies are very easily turned into agricultural ecosystems. They're very easy to plow. You don't need to cut much. And so many prairies have disappeared, but many prairies remain. And a particular type of prairie remains in the tropics, and we call them savannas. Savannas are a very interesting ecosystem, formed basically by grasses at ground level in the understory. It has 2 stories of plants, and then it has a tree story that you can see here. As a matter of fact, in Africa, the tree story is very visible because the lower part is foraged by giraffes or gazelles or other animals. So the photosynthetic layers are at ground level, formed by grasses, and then at certain altitude formed by the canopy of trees. Remember that when we saw the legumes, I explained how legumes formed association with bacteria in the roots, and they fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. They're making protein out of thin air. They fix nitrogen in the atmosphere. Savannas are amazingly symbiotic ecosystems because the grasses in the savannas don't have the ability to fix nitrogen, but by growing associated to these savanna trees, most of which are legumes, like in the New World, in the Americas, there are mesquites. In Africa, there are acacias. There are different legumes, but mostly legumes, all savannas throughout the world. The legumes are providing nitrogen and, of course, shade also, and some protection against excessive solar radiation. And the grasses are using that nitrogen and providing soil fixation, preventing that the soil where the trees are established becomes eroded. Now, apart from that, the savannas provide forage for a multitude of herbivores. There are the herbivore ecosystem par excellence. They are the places where you see these large herds of animals foraging in the grasses. It's an incredibly productive ecosystem, this mixture of grasses and legumes that form tropical savannas. You have tropical savannas in South America in a number of parts. In Venezuela, there are huge savannas, in Colombia also, but also in Brazil and Paraguay and Bolivia, there are large extensions of savanna vegetation. And of course, Africa. Africa is the continent with the largest distribution of savannas. Asia does have them, and Australia. There's practically no continent that doesn't have some form of savanna vegetation. And it's important, we'll talk about that next week, because for what we know, humans, Homo sapiens, originated as hunter-gatherers in these type of savanna ecosystems in Africa. We're all descendants of the early hunter-gatherers that used to roam around these savanna type of ecosystems in Africa. This is important to know because the association between legume, grasses, hunting, and human beings seems to be a very old one. And we'll talk later how that type of symbiosis gave origin to what we know now as modern agriculture. Now, let us move to the flower. The flower in grasses is very different to any other flower you might have seen in the plant kingdom. First of all, they don't have sepals and petals, and so they're entirely green. They're wind pollinated. They're not pollinated by insects. It's the only family where 100%, not the only, sorry, but it's one of the families, especially the only family of herbs, where 100% of the members of a family are wind pollinated. They do not have pollination by insects, and they don't produce any nectar. If you see a typical grass flower, what you will see is a rounded ovary that has normally two stigmas, and the stigmas, of course, are feathery, look like feathers or plumose, because they're basically harvesting pollen from the air. They're trapping the pollen that floats in the air. So they need to have these feathery stigmas. And then it has, remember, grasses are monocots. They have 3 anthers. Remember that in monocots, floral parts are normally in multiples of 3. They have 3 anthers coming out from under the ovary. They don't have petals and sepals, but if you look at them in detail with a good microscope, you will find this structure here known as lodicules, which are a memory of the corolla, of the sepals and the petals. Lodicules, and it has been shown now with molecular biology, the genes that command the formation of lodicules are the same genes that command the formation of petals and sepals in normal plants. So we know that grasses come from a lineage that at some point had petals and sepals, and they just became so reduced, so vestigial, that they are very difficult to see. And then it has 2 bracts. There's a large bract that covers the flower on one side that is known as the lemma, and then it has a smaller bract on the other side that is known as the pallia. So the grass floret, the basic flower of the grass, is formed by 2 bracts, the lemma and the pallia, and then inside it has an ovary and 3 stamens, and the ovary has 2 plumose styles and stigma. But that's not the whole story. The florets themselves normally are arranged in little inflorescences that we call the spikelet, in which you see one floret here, another floret here, another floret here. Here's a spikelet formed by 1, 2, 3, and the fourth floret is still in formation in this illustration. And then it has 2 leaves, 2 bracts that are known as the glooms. And you have gloom 1 and gloom 2. So the whole spikelet is supported by 2 bracts that are known as the glooms. And then each floret is supported by, yet again, another 2 bracts. that are known as the palea and the lemma. And inside that little case formed by the palea and the lemma, you will find the ovary with two plumose stigmas and three anthers coming out at some point during the process of pollination. Let me show you some illustrations. This is, for example, the spikelet of a wild oat, of the oats Avena sativa. And you will see it has one gloom here, another gloom here, and then it has one flower here, a second flower here, and a third flower in formation. Each flower has the lemma, which is the large bract, the palea, which is the smaller bract, and inside you can see the anthers and the plumose stigmas. Here, the person that took this photograph has removed the anthers and the plumose stigma, and you can see here the ovary with the two stigmas coming out. That thing you see in the back is the palea. You can see the two stamens, and you can see the loticules here quite well, which are the remnants of vestigial petals of the flower. In the case of the wheat, each spikelet has one gloom, a second gloom, and normally has at least three, sometimes four florets. You can see here one floret, another floret, another floret, and that makes three, and a fourth floret that seems in this photograph to have been aborted. But you can see always the same structure. Has one gloom, a second gloom, and then it has one floret here with a palea and the lemma, and then another floret here with the palea and the lemma, or in this case, you can see in this floret, the lemma again and the palea inside. The palea is always weaker and thinner. The lemma very often has these structures called awns that come out, like little spines coming out. Awns serve a number of purposes, but more than anything, they can get attached to the fur of animals and disperse the seed by attaching themselves to the fur of animals. Sorry. Again, in the fescue, the common fescue that is so common in the North American prairies, in the central part of the United States, each one of these is a spikelet, and you can see again in a spikelet, let me show here, one gloom, a second gloom, and then a succession of florets, one floret, a second, or we can see it here, one floret, a second floret. Normally in the fescue, each spikelet has in the order of 5 florets, 4 to 6 florets inside each spikelet. So that structure repeats itself in every grass. And then the spikelets themselves can be arranged in a number of things. For example, in wheat, the spikelets are arranged in turn in a spike. In other grasses like sorghum, for example, the spikelets are arranged themselves in a panicle. They're open, they're loose. And oats also, the spikelets are arranged in a panicle. So it's like a succession. It's like these little games with Russian dolls, one inside the other, inside the other. The floret is the basic unit of reproduction. Florets are arrange themselves in spikelets, which are subtended by 2 glooms. And then the spikelets are arranged within the plant, either in a spike or in a panicle. In a panicle, they are sort of dispersed and open. In a spike, the spikelets themselves are organized around a central axis, and they form a spike, like in wheat, for example. The grains in the Poaceae, in the grass family, are also very, very distinctive. And any of you who likes eating whole grains of corn, maize, or wheat, or barley, or even whole rice, will recognize them immediately. Remember when we studied fruits, we mentioned that grains have, there's one type of fruit known as the caryopse, in which the pericarp of the ovary becomes so intimately attached and fused with the seed itself that it's impossible to separate the pericarp from the seed itself without killing the unit, the propagation unit. These type of structures are known as caryopses. They're in many ways they're similar to achenes or to nuts. They're just a dry fruit that has one single seed on a cover, but the cover itself, the pericarp, is totally fused to the seed itself. So the whole ovary becomes the seed, including the seed, sensu stricto, anatomically the seed, and the pericarp of the ovary that becomes fused to the seed. And that type of fruit is known as a caryopsis. Also, farmers know them as kernels. Here you have a kernel of wheat that has been dissected for your observation. And you can see here, it's also the same in maize. At one part of the kernel, you will see the embryo. Here you can see the embryo. The embryo is like a little plant. You can see here the root and the root cap of the embryo, and then the first leaves of the embryo, and here the cotyledon. And then the rest of the seed inside is just this structure called the endosperm, which is basically the reserves with which the seed is endowed in order to germinate and survive. And then outside, it has a pericarp, which is the structure. It's basically the ovary that has grown with the seed. And the pericarp is normally fibrous. It's what we eliminate, for example, in rice. When we make white rice, they put them in hulling machines that will remove the pericarp, or what is removed before making white flour. But in whole wheat or in whole rice, the pericarp remains, and it's really nice to eat. It's good, it's fiber, and it has quite a bit of protein also. In the case of corn, the structure is the same. If you look at a corn grain, this is a horrible image. I need to get something better. You can see it here in this one, for example. You can see the embryo is always visible on one side of a corn seed, and then the rest is the pericarp, and outside the yellow color is, the rest is the endosperm, and then outside with yellow color, the pericarp. In the case of corn, the pericarp is almost perfectly transparent, as a matter of fact, and it allows you to see the color of the internal layer of the endosperm. And basically, when you see these corn grains that have different colors, they're very much used in the United States for Thanksgiving, these beautiful corns. Very, very often, many of these corns derive from native varieties cultivated by Native Americans, or from other native groups in the South, in Mexico or Central America. The reason why you see them in different colors is because corn, maize, reproduces with cross-pollination with other plants, and the pollen that comes to corn in a heterogeneous population with corns of different colors, the pollen can have the traits of the father that can be expressed in the grain. So here you have all the grains that are black come from fathers that had black grain, and all the grains that are yellow come from paternal contribution from pollen of plants that have yellow grain. So it's one of these beautiful examples in which you can actually see quite a bit of the diversity just by looking at the spike, looking at the formation of the seeds organized around the cob. Important plants, it's full of really important plants. Barley, for example, that we use to make beer, we use to feed animals, we use to make soup, and it can be used to make bread and many other things. You can buy barley flour. But barley is fundamentally very, very important for the fermentation of alcoholic beverages. It's made into a brew, and then that is fermented with yeast, and it's then used to distill alcoholic beverages, or to just drink the fermented concoction that is beer. Wheat. Here you can see different varieties of wheat. Some have really long awns, others are awnless, but you can see the structure here very well of the spike. All this is a spike. And you can see here, each one of these is a spikelet, is a small spike, and the spikelets are organized to form themselves a spike. And each spikelet, remember, it needs to have the typical structure, has the first glume, the second glume, and then one floret, another floret, and a third floret. They normally have 3 to 4 florets in every spikelet. Rice. Rice, as opposed to wheat, the inflorescence is a panicle. Each one of these small things is a spikelet, but the spikelets do not organize themselves into a spike, but rather into a panicle. Corn. Corn is a fascinating plant because it's one of the few grasses that have male and female flowers. The male flower forms an inflorescence known as the tassel, and it's organized as a panicle. The female flower is highly compacted, and we'll talk about later about how this evolved. But if you look at the female flower, it's covered in leaves, in true leaves, as a matter of fact, because it's a very, very compacted axis, a very compacted lateral branch. And the styles are very, very, very long and come out through the tip of the plant in order to get pollen. So the styles themselves are what forms these sort of what they call the beard of corn, or the hairs of corn. That hairy structure that comes out on the top are the styles. You can eat them, as a matter of fact. They're very nutritious. And so each one of these hairy structures, if you follow them, will reach a grain. And pollen has come down this long structure until it hit the ovary and fertilize the ovary to make a grain. Here you have some other examples of the corn plant. As opposed to many other plants that have a stage in which they form a column and the stem is at ground level, corn is more like a cane. It starts growing with a true stem up from the very beginning. You can see that the male flowers produce a panicle that is known as a tassel, and you can see here the anthers coming out. And you can see here the young female flower with the styles and the stigmas coming out, searching and sort of combing the air for pollen. The plant is receptive, and eventually the pollen will come down through these long filaments, the styles, until it reaches the embryo and fertilizes it. You can see, we'll try and do some dissection of a corn ear. You can see here the corn ear, you can see that it is really a true stem with a lot of florets packed along the stem. And you can ask me, well, if these are florets, where are the glumes? Where are the pallia, the lemma? They are there, but they're so reduced that the only thing you see once a plant is fertilized and ripens is the grain itself. If you remove the grain from the corn cob, you will see the bracts sitting there in the cob. As a matter of fact, in some ancestral corns, some ancient corns, before they were entirely domesticated, the bracts were still very visible. As a matter of fact, you can see here in this corn or in this one here, the bracts are very, very visible. Corn has a fascinating origin. Apparently it was first cultivated by the native peoples of what we know as Mesoamerica, which is basically Central America, Mexico, and even a little bit of what is now the United States. And people in Mesoamerica started cultivating this plant, the wild ancestor of corn, that is known as teosinte, and that has the ear is not at all like the ear of corn. It's a small spike. The female spike is very, very small, has the same male panicles on top, and apparently was basically cultivated to eat as juicy canes and to boil them to make sugar. In the same way we eat sugar cane nowadays. Apparently, teosinte was cultivated for the sugar in the stem that was used to make all sorts of things. And at one point, a mutation, a genetic mutation came that collapsed the lateral branches because of exaggerated apical dominance. A plant like the sunflower, I showed this to you, the sunflower. A mutation came that exaggerated the apical dominance of the plant, and the gene has been identified. And so the female flowers on the side became collapsed to the side of the stem. And that is basically the corn cob, the female flower or the female inflorescence of corn. It's a spike, really, anatomically speaking. And it's surrounded by all the leaves that used to be open in the original teosinte. Cereals are immensely important in the feeding of human societies. If you are familiar with this food guide pyramid that shows, it's very popular from the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration of the United States, that gives us information on how to eat and what to eat. The FDA guidelines establish that the base of our feeding pyramid should be basically rice, pasta, bread, and things, crackers, things like that, which are all obtained from the grains of cereals. So really, if you look at this, the base of the food pyramid in human societies, the base of our food security is the cultivation of cereals. Look at this graph. I got this graph from a statistical annuary of the United Nations, a yearbook, and it will tell you how much of different plants are cultivated to feed human societies. This is maize, this is rice, and this is wheat. In terms of calories, not in terms of weight. If you can see, maize, rice, and wheat forms almost 70%, over 2/3 of what we eat in terms of what provides calories to human beings. And if we add potatoes, cassavas, soybeans, that makes over 80%. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 crops provide over 80% of all the calories and of all our food security. The rest is just, you can call it dressing. These 6 crops are really what feeds the world and what maintains human societies alive. And of those, the 3 most important, maize, rice, and wheat, belong to the family Poaceae, to the grass family. This shows the incredible importance of the grass family in food security. And of course, some of our staple cereals that maintain us alive are oats, the genus Avena, Oryza, the genus Oryza, rice, the genus Triticum with these beautiful spikes with long awns, wheat, Zea, corn. May I still show you the grain of corn has always the embryo on this side. Barley, Ordium. Basically, as I was telling you, we wouldn't have beer if we didn't have barley. Sorghum in Africa, it's incredibly important. It's not important throughout the world, but especially in Africa, plays a huge role in feeding African societies. Bamboos play a huge role all over the world, but again, in Asia in particular, they are incredibly important, not only as a source of food, but also as a source of fibers that are used to make furniture and all sorts of, although the wood of bamboos is not true wood, but it's beautiful, it's very hard. And it's not true wood in the sense of a tree with growth rings, but it's very hard. It's a bundle of very hard fibers that can be used to do all sorts of interesting crafts. And of course, drinks in general, alcoholic drinks, we can make them. We make them, by we I mean human beings, from all sorts of grasses. From Orisa, we make sake. From rice, we make sake. From sugarcane, we make rum. From barley, rye, and corn, we make all sorts of distillates like whiskey and gin and many others. And of course, from sugarcane, we make all sorts of things, and they are sometimes a little bit too much in the base of our human calorie consumption. I sometimes I do wish we ate less sugarcane. It's not necessarily very good for us. Many grass species are used to make lawns. In California, the Bermuda grass is very important. There are many others. So grasses are really what maintain the soil in our gardens and make our lawns and soccer fields and athletic fields, also in parks. They're all made with grasses. And also, believe it or not, grasses are important in the essences and essential oils to make perfumes. Two very important grasses are Chrysopogon sisanoides, known as vetiver, that is used to make cologne for men. It smells really nice. It's a unique smell, a little bit like lavender. And Singbopogon, which is a very interesting grass. It's a grass. It looks like a grass, but if you crush the leaves and you smell them, it smells like lemon. It smells like lemon peel. So lemongrass and citronella, two essential oils, are produced from Singbopogon, also in the grass family. So I hope to have convinced you of the incredible importance of grasses. Next week, before we see the last two taxonomic groups, I hope to have a short class on the evolution of cereals and the evolution of agriculture in human societies. I thank you very much for your attention. It's Friday today, so I wish you a very nice weekend. Monday, the 25th, is a holiday. It's Memorial Day. And so the next class will be on Wednesday, the 27th. Take care, be safe, and I'll see you next week. Thank you very much.